Hi folks, thanks for stopping in. Today we're going to be taking a look at these two revolvers that I have out on the bench. On the left we have a Smith and Wesson Model 36, and on the right we have a Taurus Model 85. During the course of looking at these, we're going to be kind of dispelling a myth that the Model 85 from Taurus is essentially a copy, a clone of a Smith and Wesson J-frame, because that is not really the case. Obviously they have a lot of superficial similarities. They are both 38 special. They're both 5 rounds. They're what you might call a pocket revolver, a snubby. They're small revolvers. Double action, single action, steel frames. They have a lot in common. They both open up by pushing forward on the thumb piece there. They both rotate in a counterclockwise direction. So very similar in handling, in the way they look and feel. But what we're going to do here when I cut the video is take a look at the internals on them and see that these really aren't the same revolver internally. Certainly not a copy or anything like that. So let's go ahead and cut the video and take a look inside. And now that we have them apart, I want to address the fact that a moment ago I misspoke and said they're both double action, single action. They're both double action, only the Smith & Wesson has the single action capability with the hammer spur here. The Taurus is similar in that regard, but they've actually removed the ability for this to work in a single action way. It isn't just hammerless, but there is no sear engagement capability on this revolver. It's modified originally from the factory to not have that capability. But that is just a difference in these particular guns, because certain Smith & Wessons, of course, obviously don't have a hammer. They're hammerless, or have a concealed hammer. However, an individual revolver happens to be set up the way they're made. Now, there's also some differences here that have to do with production years. This revolver is, I believe, from probably 1968, 69 kind of time frame. Based on the features, it's a little hard to pin that down without getting with Smith & Wesson. This revolver is from the early to mid 90s, pre-97, but somewhere around there. So you'll see certain things like on the Smith & Wesson here, it has a hammer nose. The firing pin is on the hammer. New Smith & Wessons are not that way. They actually have a firing pin in the frame like this Taurus does. So that's a difference in production years, not so much a difference in design of the guns. But let's look at a couple other things here that are kind of interesting. On the Taurus, you have a transfer bar type mechanism for the safety, where when you pull the trigger, this piece here moves up and allows the firing pin to be pressed forward by the hammer. The Smith & Wesson uses the opposite system, where it actually has a hammer block, and this would normally be guided by the side plate, which we have off right now, and this stays up in the way of the hammer until it's pulled down when the rebound slide moves. Obviously, the Smith & Wesson has a rebound slide. The Taurus revolver does not have a rebound slide. So that is a difference there. In some ways, the Taurus is actually a little bit nicer because, and we'll show you this a little more closely in a second, but the Taurus is pretty easy to take apart with simple things like pieces of wire, paper clip. I actually have some paper clips over here for showing you that. The Smith & Wesson with the rebound slide, it's a good system because it adds a redundancy to the safety. where the hammer rests on this portion here until the trigger is pulled. That pushes the rebound slide back, and the hammer, this bottom part here, when it makes its travel, is able to move down and come fully forward. It isn't actually all the way forward at this particular moment because it's in its resting position. So nice that it has that extra bit of safety there. It's a redundancy in safety, or actually it's really the primary safety. The hammer block is the redundancy. So it has two different safety mechanisms there, whereas the Taurus really only has the transfer bar mechanism, which is good. The transfer bar is a very reliable safety mechanism, but so is this, but it has two of them. The downside to this transfer bar is that it is a little bit tricky to take apart. You can get underneath these and pry them out with a screwdriver. It's fine to do, but it's a little tricky. For me doing it, I've come to like this little Smith Master tool that has kind of this forked end here. There's other options available also for a dedicated tool for the task. Some folks will say they're not necessary, and I would tend to agree that they're not necessary, but they're very nice to have. Either the Brownells win that one. I'm not sponsored by any of the folks that are being mentioned, but I do prefer to have a dedicated tool for the task. You'll see here that there's another design difference that's actually pretty interesting. On your cylinder stop, the Smith and Wesson has, let me make sure that I'm in frame here to where you can see. I certainly am. Let's zoom in a little bit actually, so you guys can take an even better look at what's going on. On the Smith and Wesson, for the hammer stop, you have a spring down in here. And that's a fine way to do it. It works. Makes it a little tricky to relieve tension and get it out if you want to remove the cylinder stop, which is often why I don't during just routine cleaning and things. I'll often just leave it in. The Taurus has a design that I actually really like for that aspect. And let's see, I can probably just show it to you most easily by just very quickly removing the cylinder. There's a certain spot this has to be inside the flutes there to come out easily. Oh, okay. I thought it would come out with it. But that's just fine too. There's a little plunger. There it is. There's a little plunger here that rides in this little borehole, just like so. And that is what applies the tension to the cylinder stop. Let me see if I can get it back in now, because I really want it back in to show you. I know I'm fumbling around here a little bit. And to save you from watching me fumble around trying to get that line back up, you can see here that is the end of that plunger. So a pretty nice feature, because you're not trying to fight spring pressure when you're trying to get out the cylinder stop. You actually have this plunger that by just taking out the crane and the cylinder, you've relieved tension on it, and it's very easy to remove at that point. So pretty nice there. Let's go ahead and start getting this apart a little bit further, just so that you guys can see a little more. And I'll just do this on camera so that you can kind of watch, even though I'm sure some of this is redundant for many of you. Pull this back a little bit. There we go. And we pull out. Mainspring, Taurus, same way. Pull out. Mainspring. You can see some minor differences there, where the Smith and Wesson has more of a fork type appearance to it. The Taurus is kind of a ball end, but no real difference in function. Pretty much the same thing. And then, how do I want to do this? Let's go ahead and do the Smith and Wesson first, because it's the tricky one. So I think what you're probably gathering here as I'm talking is that the Smith and Wesson is kind of the more difficult revolver to deal with as far as disassembly goes. And that, by my assessment, is true. Even though I rather like the Smith and Wessons, I'm used to working on them, they are a little bit more advanced as far as disassembly. And so now, for the rebound slide here, I just need to come in, compress this spring, lift this up, and there we go. And it comes out. Now you can see that with the tool, it's not very difficult at all, but if you don't have the tool, it can be a little tricky. But you're still fighting spring pressure and all. There's some effort involved in it. It's not impossible, certainly not impossible, but a little more effort required to do that. Whereas your rebound spring for the Taurus, okay, so your trigger spring here that adds tension at that, all I've got to do is pull back, put a paper clip in there, push the trigger back forward, and then just give it a little wiggle because the stud is down in the frame, and that comes right out. So paper clip to do the job versus this tool to do the job. Kind of an advantage to the Taurus there, as far as kind of a clever design goes. And we'll go ahead and take the hammer out. Like so. Now, you can kind of see, well, not even kind of, you can quite well now see the transfer bar mechanism in the back there, and the way it works, where it comes up and gets over the back of the firing pin, so that when the hammer comes forward, it's actually hitting that transfer bar and causing the hammer to strike, or the firing pin to strike, allowing the hammer to transfer the energy all the way through, as opposed to the block that the Smith and Wesson uses. Go ahead and remove the triggers. That works fairly similarly. The hand is pulled back and the trigger is just wiggled off of its stud in the frame. Like so. Now, the way the Taurus is pretty nice because the hand comes off really very easily. You have this little detent here. Not even really a detent. What do you call that? A little plunger. That's spring-loaded, held in to the trigger. And all that it's really doing is working against this pin that's on the hand. Just like that. So you've got a coil spring in there that just pushes back on that plunger. and it works that way. That's what's providing tension for the ratcheting action against the cylinder. Now, the Smith and Wesson, and this is a little bit sharp. It's a very nicely made part, but it is sharp on the edges. So I just use this to pull back a little bit initially so I don't cut my fingers. And you want to make sure that if you're doing this that you don't let this come forward and scratch up the little gas shield there. The Smith and Wesson has a torsion spring inside of the trigger. And if you take the hand off of the trigger, it's fairly tricky to get that torsion spring back where it needs to be to get it all tensioned up again. Not that bad, but it takes some dental picks and paper clips and toothpicks and everything else to try to get that right. So usually I don't take these off because it's just a real hassle. So what you're starting to see here is that there's things that I typically leave alone on Smith and Wesson that on Taurus are just not a big deal. You can take them apart kind of willy-nilly and not worry too much about it. Now, that's not saying anything about quality of manufacture. This is just design aspects and working on them on a simple workbench here. We've already talked about the cylinder stops. There's really not much to see on the rest of this. There's a little bit of difference on disassembly of the cylinders. I would say the Smith and Wesson is probably a better design in that aspect. We can go ahead and look at that while we're at it. That's the thing with these Taurus cranes is they come out pretty easy as one piece like that. So for simplicity, very good. But now this assembly is more or less pressed together and it's very tight. And I've never been inclined to really get this off. I don't have any problems with the Revolver. It's working fine. I just put a little bit of oil in here because it's extremely tight and very difficult to actually get the crane off of the cylinder on this Revolver. Now the Smith and Wesson not wanting to come out for me. There we go. And this one has always been a little bit tight in that department, so there we go. So the Smith and Wesson, your crane comes off very easily. Your yoke crane comes off very easily. Just grab it and pull forward, then your cylinder is free. And that's rather nice. And then this, I think it's, yeah, clockwise. So backwards threading, and this isn't really tight, which is why I'm doing it without supporting the extractor. Normally I would support the extractor with empty casings, but I actually took this apart yesterday and just tightened it loosely. So it's very easy to get the Smith and Wesson cylinder broken all the way down so that you can clean really inside its central bore. Make sure it's so, yeah, full access there. I mean, you're down to nothing on the cylinder. The Taurus, let me see if this one's tight. And that's pretty tight, so I'm not going to take that apart. But that is basically it's retained in there. It's sort of like a spring-loaded mechanism, but pretty tricky on some of them. Not every revolver is as tight as this one. Some of them come apart pretty easily, but not as easy as a Smith and Wesson. That's an advantage to the Smith and Wesson for disassembly there, as far as the cylinder goes. But pretty much everything else, the way the hand connects to the trigger, the rebound spring, really all of that, the cylinder stop, all that's a lot easier on the Taurus. It's a pretty good, clever design. Smith and Wesson, very nicely made revolver, but a little more complicated to take apart. So obviously most people don't do this very often, as far as a full disassembly like we're seeing here. But if it is something that you do, it's kind of interesting to see that the Taurus has some clever design aspects that way. Not necessarily probably a deciding factor on what you'd end up with, but something to take note of. And definitely, if you had the idea that a Taurus is basically just a copy of Smith and Wesson, whether you heard the idea that, oh yeah, it's just made on old Smith and Wesson machinery, if Taurus has any of Smith and Wesson's machinery, they're certainly not using it in the same way Smith and Wesson does. This is different. This is a different design. Certainly there's similarities. All revolvers are going to have certain similarities, but they're definitely not the same engineering. They're not the same concept as far as the way the parts are actually all put together. And I think that'll conclude today's video as I deal with this mess of parts and getting it all back together. One thing I do want to clear up though is that I accidentally misspoke once and called the rebound slide from the Smith and Wesson when I was referring to it. I accidentally called it the transfer bar because I just gotten done talking about the transfer bar in the Taurus revolver. So that is the transfer bar, that is the rebound slide, and that is the hammer block. These two go with the Smith & Wesson, and the transfer bar, of course, goes with the Taurus revolver. If you enjoy this kind of stuff, folks, consider subscribing. Leave a comment if you have any comments, any questions, or opinions on which one you think is interesting design-wise. If you want to call me out on misspeaking on anything else, go ahead and do that too. But thanks for watching, folks, and we'll see you on the next video.